We normally associate windmills with the more rural parts of the country, such as these at Boston in Lincolnshire. But you may be surprised to learn there are several windmills in London. In this episode of The History of London, we'll be seeking out the capital's surviving windmills, and I'll also be finding the remains of several former windmills that have been put to other uses. But keep watching right to the end to discover all those London windmills that you can still visit. Using water and wind power is an ancient method to produce flour or animal feed. Watermills were most likely introduced into Britain by the Romans, and by the Middle Ages they were a common feature along the rivers and streams around the London area. The typical use of both watermills and windmills was of course for grinding grain, but they were also employed in many other processes. The survivor at Merton Abbey Mills on the River Wandle in the southwest of London, for example, was used in the production of textiles. Those who have watched my video about the New River may remember that for hundreds of years water for the City of London was supplied using water wheels beneath London Bridge. I'll put a link to that video at the end of this one. Windmills appeared in England during the medieval period. In this panorama of London from 1616 we see windmills in the hills to the north of London, and even one somewhere close to St Paul's Cathedral. But the accuracy of this and other panoramas of those times is unclear. Some that certainly existed were those at Finsbury Fields, just to the north of London City Wall, as we can see in this bird's eye map originally published in around 1560, and this map published in 1658, which shows 6 windmills grouped together in the area. It has been said that the windmills were located on slightly higher ground formed by the mound of buried bones. This may well be true. Following the religious reforms of the mid-16th century, the bones of those who had been buried in the charnel house of St Paul's Cathedral were moved through the streets of London, loaded onto 1,000 cartloads. They were buried to the north of Moorfields and covered with rubbish, and that's pretty much where those windmills were located. In 1747, the artist William Hogarth published his series of prints that he named Industry and Idleness. In the background of this one is the foreshore of the Isle of Dogs, the large peninsula on the east side of London, and there we see a row of windmills. The west side of the Isle of Dogs peninsula contained one of the most concentrated groups of windmills in the London area during the 18th century. Here is a map of the Isle of Dogs at around that time. It was then low-lying marshy meadowland, protected from flooding by a man-made bank known as Mill Wall. Many of you will know that name from the football team, which was established there before moving to South London. But Millwall actually takes its name from the numerous windmills built along the wall. Probably up to 12 windmills were built or demolished there at various times, with 10 known to be standing in around 1730. There were also others nearby at Limehouse and Blackwall. The Millwall windmills would have been quite a sight for any ship sailing down the Thames and appear in various illustrations and paintings of the time. The most common use of windmills was, of course, for milling grain of different types, but some were used for pumping water. I mentioned an example in the New River video, which was located at New River Head at what is now just to the south of Pentonville Road at Islington. It was built in 1707 with 6 sails and was used for pumping water uphill from one reservoir to another, but it proved to be somewhat unreliable and was only powered by wind for a few years. By the time these drawings were made, the sails had been taken off and the machinery was worked by horses walking around the outside. Remarkably, its base still exists, passed down in ownership from the New River Company to Thames Water, who use it as a storage shed. Another windmill used for pumping water was this one. In 1838, the London and Southampton Railway Company created their line between those two cities. It passed through a deep cutting at Wandsworth Common. Unfortunately, the cutting continually drained a local ornamental lake, so even before the railway was completed, the company were forced to construct a 4-sailed windmill at the side of the cutting to pump water back up to the lake. Several decades later, the lake was filled in and the windmill lost its purpose, but it remains as a preserved relic, somewhat modified and without its sails. There are several examples of windmills in the London area that have been repurposed over time. One of those is the windmill-style structure that stands beside the River Crane at Twickenham. It was built in 1823 on the edge of the large Hounslow gunpowder mills that had been established in the previous century. The gunpowder mills contained a large reservoir to store water used for driving the manufacturing machinery, and the windmill probably pumped water for the reservoir. At some point, the building ceased to be used as a windmill and was instead converted to become a shot tower. Molten lead was dropped from the top into a pool of water at the bottom, turning into pellets to be used as ammunition. The gunpowder works closed in 1926, and the building is now owned by Richmond Council, who lease it to the London Wildlife Trust. You can climb to the viewing level at the top if you visit when it is open. Let's look again at those windmills at Finsbury Fields. Those old maps we saw earlier are consistent in showing the windmills as box-like structures. This style is what are called post mills, which was the earliest type of windmill. One post mill survives in Greater London, which is at Keston in the borough of Bromley. In this type of windmill, the sails were fixed to the main wooden box-like structure of the building, which sits on a circular brick base called a roundhouse. As with all types of windmill, the sails have to face into the wind to operate. In this case, the entire main structure pivoted on a central post. It could then be turned around to face the wind using an exterior beam known as a tail pole. Keston windmill is certainly ancient, although the exact year of its construction is unclear, but there has been a windmill on this spot since at least as far back as the 1660s. Certainly, much of the internal structure is very old. Scratched into the base of the windmill's main post is the year 1716, but much of the wooden structure was probably rebuilt or repaired at various times after that. In the 1820s and 30s, a large amount of repair work was undertaken by William Ashby, and we will hear more about the Ashbys later in the video. The mill operated until the 1860s, at which time another windmill was established locally and took away the business. However, within a few years, this mill and its mill house were purchased, and the mill was restored as a garden feature, thus saving it for posterity. Much of Keston's machinery is still preserved on the various floors of the mill. The sails have been taken off to prevent their weight causing the main structure to capsize, but the stocks, that is the beams that held the sails, are still in place. It is one of two of London's windmills that are now in private gardens. All being well, Keston Windmill will survive as a relic to be seen by many future generations. Although not in London, one of the finest post mills in the country, and still fully functioning, is not too far away at Mountnessing in Essex. There has been a mill on the site since the 15th century, but the current building was constructed in 1807 by the Agnes family. They continued to mill there until the 1930s. These days it is owned by Essex County Council and maintained by the Friends of Mountnessing Windmill. Here inside you can see the central post on which the main structure pivots. During my visit, some of the friends pivoted or winded the mill in preparation for the sails to turn. The sails at Mountnessing are of the shutter type, similar to a Venetian blind you might have in your home. To prevent the sails turning, the shutters are left open and the wind will blow straight through. To make the sails turn, the shutters are closed, which is what is being done here. As is the case with several of those we'll be visiting in this video, you can take a tour inside Mountnessing Windmill on certain days of the year. I'll put a link in the description below. Technological development of windmills took place during the Industrial Revolution, which saw the introduction of tower mills, such as this one in Lincolnshire. In these, the main part of the building remained stationary, but with a cap at their top to which the sails were fixed. The cap and sails automatically turn to the wind with the aid of a fantail, first introduced in the 1740s, which is fixed at the rear of the cap and at right angles to the sails. Without the need to turn the entire building, as was the case with post mills, tower mills could be much larger, with some reaching as much as 100 feet or 30 metres in height. That allowed them to more easily catch the wind over the top of surrounding trees or buildings. Tower mills were usually much larger than post mills, often with multiple sets of stones, and thus able to grind a greater amount of corn. Brixton, in South London, is a bustling and multicultural part of London. But it comes as a surprise to many that only a short distance from the busy town centre is one of London's surviving windmills. Brixton stands out amongst London's windmills because it incorporates a small park, a community centre, and it still mills its own flour. There I met Neil and Jean from the windmill, who explained about its history and preservation.
So the mill was built in 1816, and throughout its life it was operated by a single family of Quakers called the Ashbys. John Ashby was the person who operated the mill from 1816. They had wider family operating mills in Kent and Surrey, and they built it with 4 common sails, which were rigged up with canvas. So in the 1820s, two of the sails were converted from canvas sails to patent sails, which have these shutters, and that's reflected in how the sails are on the windmill today. You can see the ones which you put the canvas on and the ones with the shutters, and they operated until 1862, milling under sail. And by that time, Brixton Hill was building up very rapidly, becoming developed. And the story goes that there's just much less reliable wind as the place got developed, with large buildings around and about. And there's some quite large ones immediately neighbouring, such as the waterworks and the prison, that date from that time too. So they actually stopped milling here in 1862. And they actually took the sails off in 1864. But they went and did their milling on the River Wandle at a place called Grove Mill in Lower Mitcham. And they did that for 50 years, and 40 years actually. There they had 5 stones running off the water wheel. So it would have been a much more efficient operation than here. But they still lived here in the mill cottage, and they had the bakery here, and they still grew produce on the land here, and so they're very much still the Ashbys of Brixton, and the adverts at the time do say Ashby Millers of Brixton and Mitcham. In 1902 they brought the milling back here, but they didn't need to worry about wind or water. They installed a steam-powered machine within the windmill called a modular mill, and it had French burstones, which are a much finer stone than the traditional Derbyshire millstones that would have been used in here and down in Mitcham probably. And so they're able to diversify, have different grades of flour, and they sold the flour advertised as the artificial stone ground flour with medical benefits. And so by the early 20th century, they'd set themselves up as an artisan milling enterprise, and they sold the flour to West End shops, including Harrods. And so although it was the same windmill and the same family, they had transformed from being part of the agricultural economy in the early 19th century, where local farmers would have bought their grain to be milled in a local mill. They had turned from that into a specialist supplier, much like what we're doing today, using the same mill. So the last of the Ashbys, John Joshua, milled using the modular mill until 1934, when he retired and closed the business.
Before the last miller had even given up the business in 1934, there was a discussion with SPAB, the Society for Protection of Ancient Buildings, and Lambeth Council about the future of the mill. And when he died, he had left in 1935, he had left the mill to his housekeeper because he was an unmarried man, and in trust. And he also said to his solicitor that he really wanted the mill to be preserved as a relic of the Brixton's rural past. There was a danger that the mill would be pulled down after the Second World War and the land used for housing, but fortunately a group of local residents got it listed in 1951.
In 1957, the windmill and the surrounding land was then taken over by the London County Council, and eventually in the 1970s by Lambeth Council. The mill house and other buildings were all demolished in the early 1960s, and the Windmill Gardens public park created, with the windmill as a feature within it. Over the following decades, the mill went through cycles of restoration and degradation, until Friends of Windmill Gardens was formed in the early 2000s. A campaign was started to restore the building, and in 2010 an award was granted by the Heritage Lottery Fund that allowed that to happen.
It was very popular to reopen the windmill. In 2011 there was a big parade up Brixton Hill of over 2,000 people to celebrate the fact that the windmill was open. And the Friends themselves were really keen to get milling again, and in 2014 they started the process of preparing to get some of the volunteers able to mill flour and for that flour to be then distributed locally. That happened and was very successful, and during the pandemic, in fact, we were able to have our millers as essential workers producing flour, which was distributed to local food banks and to people who came and bought it, were able to buy it.
As I mentioned earlier, in tower windmills, the sails are attached to a structure at the top called the cap. The cap turns so that the sails always face into the wind. Usually the fantail automatically turns the cap, but that isn't the case at Brixton. Let's go up into the cap with Nick.
This mill never had a fantail for turning the cap into the direction of the wind, so instead there's this hand crank, which it takes two of us a lot of effort to turn, and it takes us about half an hour to turn it to get the cap to rotate about 180 degrees, which is very hard work. But on the other hand, the fantail is a very delicate item to keep maintained.
One of the aims of Friends of Windmill Gardens was to create an education and visitor centre, which in 2020 opened beside the windmill. Schools bring pupils to the centre to carry out projects, and a small patch of wheat is kept to show them how it grows. The Friends organise health and well-being and other events in the centre and in the park. And the windmill is open to the public during summer weekends. You can find details on their website, and I'll put a link in the video description below. As we heard earlier from Nick and Jean, flour is still milled at Brixton using the old modular mill. Let Sarah explain about the milling, starting with flushing the millstones at the start of the process.
The output of the flushing from the stones is called spoil, and this is obviously not for sale, so we dispose of that, or some people make dog biscuits with it. We then want to start setting the stones to achieve the correct flour output. When checking the flour output to see whether you've set the stones properly, you're using something called rule of thumb, which is an ancient miller's term, and this is taking a small amount of output of flour and rubbing it between your finger and thumb. What you're looking for is you're wanting to feel a cool silkiness almost to the flour. And once you're happy with that, then you've left the stone set for the duration of the milling. We would definitely check this periodically while we're milling, just to double check. Many things can influence the quality of the flour that comes out. It could be the humidity on the day that you're milling, obviously the position of the stones, the throughput of the grain through the stones, but even almost what the temperature was like when the flour was when the grain was harvested. All of these can have a different impact. So you'll check the rule of thumb of the flour multiple times while you're milling. So today we're milling flour for a local bakery, which means we'll mill into 12.5 kilo sacks. At other days we might be milling into smaller bags for sale at our centre or for local shops to sell. So today's quite an easy, lazy day because we will just fill the bags up, weigh them, seal them and store them. If we were filling bags for sale here, then that's a slightly more laborious process where we have to weigh them and seal them at the end of the milling session.
Thanks, Sarah. Stay with me and we will visit London's other surviving windmills. In the meantime, just a quick reminder that if you're enjoying this video, don't forget to click like and subscribe to the channel if you'd like to get notifications of future videos. Perhaps also leave a comment to let me know what you think. Brixton is one of 2 tower windmills in London that you can visit. The other is at Shirley, a suburb of Croydon. I went there with Kent Sadler, one of the friends of Shirley Windmill.
Welcome to Shirley Windmill, a tower mill built in 1854 to replace an earlier post mill which had burnt down that year. So when you come in on the road, don't be misled by Post Mill Close. It's a tower mill. The land around here was originally common land. That was then sold on in the early 1800s. And by 1807 was being leased to one of the Alwyn family, who were local yeoman farmers. The post mill was then built and worked by William and then his son Richard until Richard's death in 1850. His son, also known as Richard, then took over the operation of the post mill until 1854, when sadly it burnt down. Richard Alwyn took the opportunity to build a more modern structure, the tower mill in which I'm now standing. But some of the structure comes from all over the place. We don't know exactly where, but there were mills such as a mill in Stratford which were being demolished because of population growth, and some of the machinery we think comes from there. There are timbers in the mill that date back even earlier to the 1740s, and it's possible that these timbers may have been in the earlier post mill. The mill itself has two sets of stones, a French burr and Derbyshire millstone grit. It was used for both human flour for bread and cakes, and also for grinding up pulses for animal food. And in this mode, it carried on working right through to Richard's death in the 1870s. His sister then took over managing the mill, but not running it herself, before selling it on to the Rayson family. It was at this time that the need for white flour and the importation of grain from overseas meant that windmills such as our own could not produce white flour and were failing. Rayson used the mill primarily for animal food until his death in 1890. The mill was then struck by lightning, not once, but twice, and was in danger of becoming totally derelict until a benefactor came along in 1925 and restored the mill, but not to a working condition. A further restoration was carried out in 1935, but then the mill was much left to its own devices. The mill survived in this state until the early 1950s, when due to the increasing population of Croydon, it was decided to move and rebuild John Ruskin Grammar School. Croydon Council acquired the mill and surrounding land, and planning permission was granted for a new school. Thankfully, whilst the surrounding buildings had been destroyed, the mill was allowed to stand and became very much a key part of the John Ruskin School. And in fact, in the 1960s, some of the children even went as far as putting an effigy of the headmaster suspended below the fantail. I know the team that did it. The school became a comprehensive in the early 1970s and continued to educate people, young people, including sixth formers, until 1990, when it was closed and subsequently demolished. Croydon Council now sold the land, but not the windmill itself, to developers who built the estate that now surrounds the mill. Post Mill Close, sadly, not Tower Mill Close, but the developers provided funding for the refurbishment of the mill, as did a successful bid to the Heritage Lottery Fund, which secured over £200,000. Following the refurbishment, the mill was opened to the public with the assistance of the Friends of Shirley Windmill in 1995, and has continued to be open to the public on certain days ever since.
There is one other tower windmill in London that is complete with sails, which is at Arkley in the borough of Barnet. It is now in a private garden, however, and not open to the public, so the photograph was kindly supplied by a local estate agent and the property owner. Arkley Windmill was built in the early 19th century, but for a long period it continued milling with a steam engine. During that time, 2 of its sails were taken down, as you see in this picture. It was largely restored in the 1980s with full sails, but not to full working order. Before we leave tower windmills and move on to a different style, let's visit a curiosity, a windmill that was turned into a pub. I joined local history expert William Dixon at the Old Mill pub at Plumstead Common in South East London.
Here we are in Plumstead, and we're standing here in front of the old Plumstead windmill. The construction of this windmill has 2 dates, either 1764 or 1786, but we think, judging by Hasted's map of 1778, which doesn't show this windmill here, that the later date is more reliable. Hasted's map is important because it shows the Woolwich Common windmill, and that windmill is interesting for the construction of this windmill here, because that Woolwich Common windmill was maliciously burnt down. The story behind that we don't know, but one thing we are fairly certain of, that it influenced the building of this windmill in brick. We do have a picture of the original windmill drawn by William Ranwell, a local artist, and this was drawn in 1820, and it shows this windmill complete. It had a cap with the sails on it, and at the back of the cap box with a chain mechanism for turning the cap and the sails into the wind. You can also see in that picture the 3 windows which still are in the tower today. In addition, you will see the wooden staging at the bottom of the tower, and that wooden staging played a part in the history of this mill, because in 1827 the army was doing a sham battle all along this common and all the way up to Bostel Heath. Quite a big battle to train their soldiers, and this attracted a crowd who took advantage of the staging around the mill and gathered on that staging, and despite warnings there was overcrowding and the stage collapsed, causing injury to a number of people. The collapse of this staging possibly anticipates the future of the windmill itself. For by 1848 it was no longer serving a purpose for the local inhabitants in grinding their corn, and in 1848 it had become a pub. The cap had been removed, the sails of course then gone, and we have the tower that we have today, surviving of course because it was amalgamated into a pub, but also it was made of brick. There was another element for this mill, its part in local history, where in 1876 there was the Plumstead Common riot. That riot was to ensure that this common was not enclosed to become a housing estate. The rioters assembled in front of the old mill here, and there were some 1,000 people, and they succeeded in the end in getting the 1786 Plumstead Common Act passed, which confirmed this area to be a common, and that's the area which this pub still faces onto.
A variation of the tower windmill was the Smock mill, which was a type probably introduced into England by Dutch engineers brought to drain the fens of Lincolnshire. Typically, the lower part of the building is made of brick, and the upper part, often octagonal, was of horizontal weatherboarding. They were usually surrounded by a gallery, and the name originated because the overall appearance was said to look like a farm worker's smock. This one was the Wellington Mill at Barking, built in 1815 and named after the then recent battle. It was used up until 1926. There were several large smock mills in the Lambeth area, such as this exceptionally tall example that towered over the surrounding buildings. There is only one surviving smock mill within Greater London, which is at Upminster on the border with Essex. There I met Justin Coombs and Paul Sainsbury, 2 trustees of the Friends of Upminster Windmill. And Paul can give us a brief history of the windmill.
Upminster Windmill was built in 1803 by a farmer called James Noakes. It was built on top of a hill where all the corn was growing. It continued throughout its life by various farmers, mainly the Abraham family, who ran the mill until 1934, when the family passed away and the windmill was put up for auction and then taken over by Essex County Council.
It was only a few years after the construction of the windmill that the owner, James Noakes, installed a steam engine so that the mill could work even when there was no wind, and to provide additional capacity. Noakes also added a large mill house and several farm buildings in which to keep animals.
The rest of the buildings at the back of the mill included a steam mill and ancillary buildings. The steam mill consisted of a boiler room, a steam engine and a grinding room. There was also a coal place for storing the coal for the steam engine, and pig courts where they kept the pigs, which they were fed off the waste of the mill.
All the ancillary buildings were demolished by Essex County Council in the 1960s, but you can still see where they were located behind the mill. In 1965, London's borders were redrawn and Upminster became part of Greater London. Ownership then passed to the newly formed Borough of Havering. In recent years, Upminster Windmill has been fully restored back to working order and is now one of the finest functioning windmills in the country. Justin explained how the restoration took place.
The restoration started in 2016. The mill was disassembled from the top down, the sails taken off, the fantail, and then the cap, which weighs about 11 tonnes, brought down to the ground. That was all taken over to the workshop in Holland of the Dutch millwright Willem Dijkstra. He spent the next year or so assessing the cap, levelling all the timbers, ensuring the whole thing was square and true. And subsequent to that, came back to the UK to work on the Smock Tower. The octagonal Smock has been completely re-levelled. 7 of the 8 corner or cant posts, as they're called, had to be replaced due to the ingress of water over the years that had caused substantial rot. But we now have a really firm, true tower, and the cap was replaced on top of it. The kind of highlight of the restoration was at the end of 2020, when the cap was placed back on, and it's now turning to wind, which is fantastic. And you can start to see here the sort of range and complexity of the machinery we've got at Upminster, particularly the belt-driven auxiliary machinery. So it's typical to restore a windmill to the state it would have been at the end of its working life. But in this case, someone called Keston came along, a Suffolk millwright in the 1940s. And he added a lot of this additional machinery with the goal of kind of increasing the yield from the wheat and reducing the labour that was needed to mill. Unfortunately, though, he never finished his restorations, but the machinery was largely in place by that point. So we've restored the mill to what we think Hector had planned it to look like. So we're up here on the dust floor now, just below the mill's cap. This beam up here is the curb upon which the cap turns to wind. But you can appreciate from here the detail that's gone into the restoration. Every piece of timber has been catalogued. You can see these little yellow stickers with the number. Every single piece has been assessed to see whether it could be retained. And where necessary, new timbers have been used. So you can see this camp post here is a new structural timber. And you can see a lot of examples where the new has been blended with the old. So down here, we've got one of the original timbers from the mill across there, with this new timber scarfed onto the end, held by the peg in the middle there. A lot of the internal machinery has been repaired by volunteers, but the wallower here was built by the millwright. This is a brand new wallower, and he's also recogged the brake wheel. So you can see we have a really nice mesh between those two wheels now.
Now let's go right up to the top of the mill, from where there is a fantastic view, and see how the fantail turns the cap of the sails to face into the wind.
And so we're up in the cap now, and you can see the mill is actually turning to wind as we speak. The fantail out there is driving around these cogs here, just gently turning it into the wind.
Now let's see what happens when the wind blows and the sails turn. Steve Hearn, one of the volunteers at Upminster, can explain. We're starting near the top of the windmill, on the floor below the cap.
So here we are on the dust floor. This floor was to stop any dust either coming up to where the gear mechanism was, or any dust from the cap going down towards the grain. So through the storm hatch up here, we can see the sails fitted to the main wind shaft, which comes into the windmill. And on the wind shaft, we have the big brake wheel. This brake wheel with the gear teeth then drives the wallower, and that changes from a rotation here to then a vertical rotation down into the windmill. The brake wheel also has the feature of having a brake that goes all the way round, and which is operated by the brake lever over there, which allows us to stop the windmill when we don't want it to run. So we're now on the bin floor, so we've come down one floor, and this is where the grain would be brought up to with the sack hoist, and then the grain put into the bin for movement down towards the millstones.
Typically, in a windmill, prior to milling, grain was stored on an upper floor above that of the millstones. The sacks of unmilled grain therefore needed to be lifted up through the floors using the sack hoist. Like the millstones, the hoist was powered by the rotation of the sails.
So we have a rope that goes all the way to the ground floor, and by pulling on the rope, we then take out any slack in the drive belt, which then drives the main shaft for the chain, bringing the sack all the way up from the ground floor. So from the ground floor, you can totally control all the way up. As it goes through the doors, you hear the doors go bang, bang, so you know how many floors it's gone up. So here we are now on the stone floor, where we have 4 millstones. We have 2 Derbyshire stones, one here and one over there, and then 2 French burr stones, one there and one there. So the grain would come in from the hopper this way down into the hopper here, and then down into the funnel towards the millstone. The funnel itself would be preloaded against a damsel, and as the damsel is turned by the stone, it gets knocked either side with the grain coming down the chute into the millstone.
Thanks for the explanation, Steve. We've now looked at post, tower and smock mills. The final example of a London windmill is a type that is common in Holland but unusual in England. The Wimbledon windmill is known as a hollow post windmill. In this type of windmill, the sails turn a shaft that passes through the hollowed out core of the building's main supporting post, driving the machinery below. With its unusual shape and its location on Wimbledon Common, the Wimbledon windmill is certainly visually attractive. In 1816, the carpenter Charles March applied to the Manor Court of Wimbledon to construct a windmill on the common. Work took place the following year. The surrounding common land was then devoid of trees, so the windmill must have been a prominent landmark. The mill ground wheat for the local districts of Wimbledon, Putney and Roehampton. Perhaps March decided on this design because he was a carpenter rather than a miller. He may have been influenced by this one at Southwark that stood at that time near the site of the original Globe Theatre, and there was also another hollow post mill working at Mitcham throughout the first half of the 19th century. At Wimbledon, a fantail turned the upper box structure of the mill and its sails into the wind. Originally, only the ground floor walls were made of brick, while the first floor was timber framed and boarded, as was the mill at Southwark. In 1818, March was granted an additional quarter acre of land, and he constructed a cottage for a miller, which still stands behind the windmill. The lord of the manor of Wimbledon was Earl Spencer. In 1864, he began enclosing Wimbledon Common with a plan to form a private park. As part of this plan, he purchased the lease of the windmill from the Marsh family, the millers at that time. They removed the millstones and machinery so that Wimbledon could not be used to compete with other mills they owned at Kingston. As we heard at Plumstead, there was a strong opposition to enclosure of common land, and Earl Spencer's bill to enclose Wimbledon Common failed to be passed by Parliament. Then no longer operating as a mill, the Earl converted it into living accommodation for 6 families. Various alterations were carried out to the building, including facing the first floor walls with brick. The Wimbledon and Putney Commons Act of 1871 handed over the care of the windmill to the Wimbledon and Putney Commons conservators, but the building was by then in decline. The old windmill was seen as something from a bygone and slower age, however, and something that should be preserved as a local landmark. For the next 100 years, several major renovations took place, each followed by a period of decline. From the 1970s, the windmill was again restored, and the 2 floors of its base converted into a museum that tell the story of windmills and the different types. I paid a visit and was able to meet the remarkable Norman Plastow, the man responsible for the restoration of the windmill and creation of the museum.
Well, I was born in Wimbledon, so I knew the common well from being a child. But it happened that I was walking on the common with a friend who was the structural engineer, and we noticed that the windmill looked in very poor condition. And we decided to examine it and see what was wrong. And having discovered what was wrong, we spent a year working on it. And there were many surprises. One had to understand how the building was constructed and then what had gone wrong. Most post mills are quite small and have all the machinery inside them. This one is based upon a quite different type of mill, where you have the mill, which is turned by the wind, built on the roof. and then it drives down a shaft into the building to turn all the machinery which is kept there. Well, some of the work we did ourselves, but it was mainly a local builder who lived in Wimbledon, Mr. Green, who was very flexible. We didn't know exactly how much work was going to be involved, so we couldn't draw up a fixed contract. It meant that he had to work week by week doing the new things which were discovered. Along came Bert Follen. He was a millwright. He had worked on the restoration of mills and the maintenance of mills over a long period of time. He came from Norfolk, but he'd moved to a place near Wimbledon, and he discovered what we were doing and offered to help. Now, he had an amazing collection of tools which he'd used over the years, and for specialist work, anything to do with the milling process itself, he was able to help. Bert Follen had retired, obviously, was living on his own, and he had all his tools still with him and a workshop at his house, and so he did various repairs and improvements to pieces of milling machinery. Now, eventually, he was going to die, and he knew this, and so he arranged in his will that all his tools should be left to the museum. And we collected them all when he died, and we have them in a separate room downstairs. I needed to find out more about windmills than I already knew, and apart from reading lots of books on the subject, I visited many mills around the country. Now, some of these were in absolutely derelict state, and by negotiating with the owners, I was able to obtain pieces of machinery and equipment which would illustrate how windmills worked. So I used to tour around the country collecting these things. I collected one gear wheel from Aberdeen, but my journeys weren't normally that long. I visited windmills at the weekend, and while I was there, I carried out a survey of each of the mills to find out how it was built, what it contained, and so on. And those which were in a really bad condition, where they were absolutely falling apart, I managed to negotiate the transfer of some piece of machinery to illustrate how mills worked. So, having obtained the information on various mills and discovered how different they could be, I decided to make models of these to display in a museum. So, every windmill I visited, I would measure up, carry out a detailed survey, find out what it had actually looked like in its working days. And then at home, I would spend many hours making detailed models of the mills to show what they were like. So we have a display of millstones here. The small ones came from India and still used at present. But the larger stones, that is an example of an English millstone. It's made from a form of sandstone, and the grooves cut into it are to catch the grain between the stones and crush them, and the flour comes out around the edge of the stone. There's another type of stone which comes from France. Now, this is not made from sandstone, it's made from quartz. But the quartz doesn't come in large slabs, so they have to make them up by putting together blocks of quartz. And then to hold them together, you have this iron core where the spindle comes through, and the outside has iron straps tied round it to keep the blocks together. These also have grooves cut into them, but they're not really visible.
As you see, their unsuccessful attempt to turn Wimbledon's sails illustrates that windmills depended on unreliable wind. By the early 19th century, steam-powered engines were increasingly used, which could grind corn at any time. In 1786, the steam-powered Albion Mills opened on the side of the Thames at Southwark. Such was its efficiency and vast capacity that soon 500 people were employed by the company, and for several years it had a monopoly on supplying flour in London. That monopoly may have been its downfall, because after just 5 years in operation, the building was destroyed by fire, with many suspecting arson. The poet William Blake lived nearby, and the gutted remains of the building are said to be the inspiration for the phrase "dark satanic mills" in his famous poem "And Did Those Feet in Ancient Time," and the subsequent song "Jerusalem." In 1846, tariffs were repealed that had prevented cheaper imported grain to arrive in Britain. But the grain that began to arrive from North America was a harder type than soft English grain and unsuitable to be ground by traditional methods. Thereafter, the milling of flour was undertaken by mass-production, steam-driven roller mills. By the middle of the 19th century, windmills were mostly redundant. If you can, try to get along to the open days at Mountnessing, Brixton, Shirley, Upminster and Wimbledon windmills. I'll put links to each in the description below. I hope you've enjoyed the video. Please remember to like it, and don't forget to check out the History of London channel for more in this series.